All right, U.S. history students, we are going to continue our look at the development of government in U.S. history, beginning with kind of where the Articles of Confederation end. So we have looked pretty closely at the Articles of Confederation, understand that they were intentionally weak in order to protect state and individual liberties, because the states were concerned about the development of a government that, a strong central government that might potentially abuse state and individual liberties. But the thing that really cracks the Articles of Confederation or ultimately demolishes it is the inability of the national government to enforce taxation. So the national government could request that each state pay taxes, but it was simply that. It was a request, and requests can be refused, and that's exactly what the states often did. They often refused the request to pay taxation. So this puts the federal government in a position where it's consistently broke. The Articles of Confederation is unable to unify the states, and as a result, we see problems like Shays' Rebellion, which proves the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, ultimately leading to the call for the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So at the Constitutional Convention, 55 delegates from the states arrive with the intent that they will modify the Articles of Confederation. They recognize that the Articles of Confederation are incredibly weak, and therefore making the United States of America weak. Quickly, they realize that the Articles of Confederation are not going to be able to be saved, and they're going to have to start from scratch with a brand new document creating a new form of government, and a form of government that will strengthen the national government. So instead of revising the Articles of Confederation, they simply replace it with the Constitution. I hate to say simply replace. It's not a simple thing. It's actually quite a complex thing. But they replace the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. So the Constitution was a radical shift from the Articles of Confederation because it gave more power to the national government than to the state governments, which makes it actually quite controversial at the time. It includes something called the Supremacy Clause, which establishes the Constitution, not the state governments, as the supreme law of the land. So essentially saying that the national laws will always take precedence over or always be supreme over state laws. So if there was basically a fight between a state law and a national law, the national law is going to win. The national government under the Constitution would have new features and powers that the Articles of Confederation did not have, and these changes are designed to make the Constitution an improvement over the Articles of Confederation. So rather than a single unicameral or single house Congress, the new national government would be divided among 3 equal branches of government. So it would have like the Articles of Confederation, government had a legislative branch. It had a Congress, which would make laws, but it added the power to tax or enforce taxation, and it adds the ability for the national government to coin money. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state could print its own currency, which created a lot of confusion and difficulties in commerce between the states. The Articles of Confederation adds the executive branch. So it creates the office of the president, which will lead the nation and enforce laws created and passed by Congress. It also adds a judicial branch, which is a court system that will interpret laws and prosecute federal crimes. Delegates at the Constitutional Conventions have a lot of disagreements with one another, but there are a couple of ideas that ultimately they do agree on as they are creating this new national government. The first is the concept of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is something that is going to pop up pretty regularly in this course, particularly leading up to the Civil War. And popular sovereignty is essentially that the people will vote on governmental decisions. They will vote on government leaders who will represent them in Congress, who will help make decisions that are in their best interest, but essentially that the voice of the people will be heard in government. They agree on the concept of limited government. So even though the new national government under the Constitution will be stronger, the government will be limited so that citizens' individual liberties will be protected. They also agree on the concept of federalism, and that is that the national government shares power with the state governments. So you might notice that in Georgia, for example, we have a state income tax, and that there is also a federal income tax. So those are things that both the state government does and the federal government does, and that sort of, I think, is a good example of federalism because it is the ability of both state and national government to essentially do the same thing. So if we look at this chart here, what you see in blue on the left-hand side of the Venn diagram are all of the functions that only the national government can do. Only the national government can regulate foreign and interstate commerce. Only the national government can coin money. Only the national government can create an army and navy. So essentially, the state of Georgia cannot create its own army. Only the national government can declare war, and so on and so on. There are powers that are reserved, and you can see they're called reserved powers here. There are powers that are reserved for the states. The states can regulate intrastate commerce. They can establish local government systems, so county governments, city governments. They administer all elections, including national elections, and they protect the public's health, welfare, and morals. And so that's where you get the state education systems, state public health systems, state law enforcement. But there are some things that are shared. So I mentioned a moment ago that both the state of Georgia and the national government levy taxes. They can both borrow money. They can both spend for the general welfare. They can both establish courts as evidenced by federal court and state court, and they can enact and enforce laws. So federalism is the idea that there are some powers that belong to the states, powers that belong to the national government, and a few things that they share. In addition to the idea of limited government, the idea of federalism, the delegates also agree that there should be a separation of powers. So they're stealing ideas from Baron de Montesquieu here when they institute three branches with defined powers. The idea is that with the three separate branches, there will be a system of checks and balances in which each branch can limit the power of the others. So the delegates at the convention agree on some things, but they disagree on quite a few others. And in order to overcome these disagreements, they had to negotiate a series of compromises in order to agree on a framework for the government. Many of these compromises dealt with how representatives would be chosen from the states to serve in Congress. So this is a big deal because the more representatives you have in Congress, the more power you have in Congress. So for example, if the state of Texas has 55 representatives, that means they have 55 votes in Congress. If Wyoming has 3 representatives, they only have 3 votes in Congress. So who has more power, the state with 55 votes or the state with 3 votes? So you kind of see the more representatives you have, the more power you have. So the first question that comes up is how will we balance the interests of large states versus small states? So if you look at population density at the time, you can see there was, fairly high, population centered on the coast. But in states like Virginia, for example, you have a high population, you have a lot of land area. And so this is going to be what we call a big state. New Jersey, which is right here, is a small state. They don't have as many people because they're just physically smaller. So we have a large state versus small state problem. Large states supported the Virginia plan, which proposed adding a president to lead the nation, a bicameral or 2-house Congress in which larger states would have more representatives. The small states supported the New Jersey plan, which called for a unicameral or single-house Congress in which states are equally represented, just like the Articles of Confederation. The plan that is ultimately resolved between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan is called the Great Compromise, which resolves the differences between the large and small states by creating a bicameral or 2-house Congress. The Senate, which is the upper house, so this is Congress, and within Congress you have both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Senate has equal representation. Every state, regardless of size, has 2 senators who serve 6-year terms. In the House of Representatives, the number of representatives is determined by each state's population. So Texas, which is a larger state, is going to have more representatives in the House of Representatives, but it's only going to have 2 senators. The next question is a disagreement between the southern states versus the northern free states. So the northern and southern states could not agree on whether or not to count slaves towards population size. If slaves are counted, southern states would have more votes and power in the House of Representatives. The 3/5 compromise allowed states to count 3 of every 5 slaves towards taxation and population size. There's also a discussion about whether or not to end slavery. Many Northerners wanted to use the Constitutional Convention to end slavery, but Southerners threatened to leave or secede from the United States anytime slavery was discussed. As a compromise for the South, the slave trade could continue for 20 more years and runaway slaves would be returned to slave masters. So this is an example, I think, where the Founding Fathers recognized that slavery is an exceptionally complicated question for the new nation. And instead of really dealing with it, they kind of kick the can down the road a little bit. James Madison is considered to be the father of the Constitution. He negotiates and wrote much of the framework of the new government and is referred to as the father of the Constitution. So James Madison's kind of an interesting fellow in that he is a founding father, but he doesn't have really the personality of John Adams. He doesn't really have the gravitas of George Washington. He doesn't have the resume of Thomas Jefferson. He's 5'4". He's kind of pudgy. He's not really the most attractive guy in the room, but what he is almost always the smartest guy in the room. And so James Madison is the person who helps craft the Constitution and also ultimately the Bill of Rights.